Welcome back. I know I promised you we'd be doing a bunch of exercises today. As it worked out, we will basically just be talking, so you won't need to sort of have a pen or pencil or not to do specific exercises. Also, looking at this room, I think it'd be better to do exercises where you have to write stuff in the other room. You have much more space on your desk and everything, so probably we'll do exercises more Thursdays than Tuesdays. Today, what we're going to do is look at the basics of arguments, the basic structure of an argument, what an argument is and what it isn't. This is really preliminary stuff, but it's helpful to get a couple of the sort of terms and ideas on the table, and we'll go through at least one or two of the things that you'll pretty much want to watch out for in making and evaluating arguments sort of along the way. So before I get into the material, are there any kind of course questions? Any course mechanics questions? I'll point out that there's the survey is due tonight. I see most of you already filled out the survey, so that's great. But for those of you who still haven't done it, please do fill out the survey before midnight tonight, and we'll talk about it on Thursday. I am also supposed to do something before midnight tonight. I'm supposed to post the first quiz. So I'll have that up on Blackboard by tonight. It'll be due 1 week from now. It really won't be a big deal. It shouldn't take you very long. Once you've gone through the material, at least, the answers should sort of be straightforward to you. And if something isn't straightforward to you, you can take the test, you can take the quiz again and again until you get them all right. So I expect the average to be absurdly high on that. You should keep taking it until you get 100%, and then we can talk about it in class why the answers were what they are. Okay, so that's for midnight tonight. Fill out the survey, and hopefully I'll have the quiz posted. The quiz might look at things that we haven't talked about in class yet, so don't panic if you don't recognize something on there. But okay. Anybody think of a question about how this course is going to go? No? Good? Okay, good. So, talking about arguments. And arguments are the main topic of this course. So I said on last Tuesday that we're thinking about thinking. The kind of thinking we have in mind specifically is arguments. So we're thinking about how arguments work, what makes an argument good and what makes an argument bad. I want to warn you that throughout this course I'm going to be using a whole bunch of terms that you're very familiar with and use in a whole variety of ways. And I'm going to ask you to focus on just one kind of technical meaning. So we're going to develop a kind of technical jargon throughout the course of this semester, and argument is one of those things that I'm going to ask you to forget everything that you know about how people use the word argument in day-to-day life. Because usually what they mean by, if I say I had an argument with my wife, I don't mean that, we exchanged reasons or something like that. It means that, we raised our voices or we had a conflict or something like that. So that's what usually people mean by an argument. They mean like an interpersonal conflict. And it could just be people yelling like, you're a jerk, no, you're a jerk. Well, that's a kind of argument. But that's not what we mean by argument in this class. In this class, an argument can happen, you can present arguments to yourself. One person can argue something to themselves. It's really just one reason, one idea given as a reason for believing another idea. That's all we mean by arguments here. So forget the kind of if you want to talk about what happens when two people are exchanging arguments, let's call that a debate. Right, so a debate is when two people are trying to convince each other of something, and they're giving each other arguments in this sense. Right? So they'll be giving each other reasons to believe either that the conclusion is true or that the conclusion is false. So keep that in mind. If you say something is an argument, what you're saying, in this class at least, is that it's got at least three features. It's got a premise or premises. So these are ideas being given as a reason for believing. The conclusion. The conclusion is the thing that the argument aims at. But notice that the argument is not the premise. The argument is not just the thing being given as a reason to believe, and it's not just the conclusion. It's the premise being given as a justification for the conclusion. So there's like a premise, a conclusion, and then a relation of justification between them. Right? So arguments are the whole package, not just the premises. This is another way that people very commonly use the word argument. They use it just to mean a premise in an argument. Again, Nothing really important hangs on this, but I just want us to all have the same kind of basic vocabulary so that when you're writing your tests and your argument analyses, you can show the TAs that you're following along with the course and that you understand what's being said. So we're all trying to get the same common language that's sort of artificial and not really like the way that you're used to talking, but it'll be useful for the purposes of this course. So for the purposes of this course, an argument is an idea or set of ideas being given as a justification or a reason for believing some conclusion. Okay? And it's the whole package, not just the premise. Right. So the example I gave you last time, my legs are itchy. Suppose that's being given as a reason to believe that the plants that you just walked through were poison ivy. Right? So again, this is not an argument that's completely sound in the sense that it's not an argument that like guarantees the truth of its conclusion, but it's an argument. In this case, it's being presented as a reason, one thing being given as a reason to believe another thing. Similarly, you could say the lights are on, therefore somebody is at home. This is given one thing, an observation statement, being given as a reason to believe another thing, that somebody's at home. Right? And again, this argument is not the kind of maximal strength argument. It's not the argument that if the premises are true, it guarantees the truth of the conclusion, but it is something that should sort of increase your confidence in the conclusion. Okay, so none of this should be challenging at all so far. We're really just getting common terms on the table. But. Right, so an argument usually contains an inference, right? Or always contains an inference, that is going from one thing to the other. So an inference is where we try to use one thought or idea to justify another thought or idea. The first is being given as a reason for believing the second. And I think I emphasized last time that if you could give the general conditions under which one thing justifies another, like if you could say in all cases when one idea is sufficient to accept another, you would be done most of philosophy, math, logic, quite a bit of science. Like these are questions that we are continuing to work on in detail, but we can give you some of the sort of basics in this class. Right. So when you're trying to decide whether something is an argument or not, you look for inference indicators. Inference indicators are words that are flag something as being an inference that somebody wants you to make. So therefore, since, thus, implies, consequently. Because is a tricky one, and I'll show you why in this lecture, because isn't always indicating that you're dealing with an argument. It's not always an inference indicator in that sense. Sometimes you can have because functioning as an explanation term. And we'll spend some time at the end of this lecture distinguishing explanations from arguments. So they do different things. It follows that, given that. And of course, sometimes you just have to, the speaker just leaves it to you to figure out that something is being presented as an argument. You just have to like look at it and understand. So, for example, can you read that by the way? That's not bad, okay. So for example, I am hungry, therefore we should make dinner. The therefore functions as an inference indicator being telling you that one thing is being given as a reason to believe the other thing. Since I'm hungry, we should make dinner. I'm hungry, thus we should make dinner. Because I'm hungry, we should make dinner. The fact that I'm hungry implies that we should make dinner. I don't know anybody who talks like this, but these are inference indicators in action. I'm hungry, consequently we should make dinner. And to show you the case where there is no explicit inference indicator, you say, I'm hungry, let's make dinner. So this is an argument, but there's nothing explicitly flagging it as an argument. But it is an argument because it's one thing being given as a reason to believe another thing. First, I am hungry, therefore we should make dinner. Right? So these are the kinds of words that are typical of sort of indicating that an inference is being made or an inference is being presented to you, and therefore an argument is taking place. We've got two kinds of inference indicators, and I want to distinguish these not because I don't think you know how these words mean, but because I want to point out to you that it's not a reliable way of figuring out which part is the premise and which part is the conclusion to look at the order. So the order of the premise and conclusion can be one way or the other. So You've got conclusion indicators, which say, here's a premise, and here comes a conclusion. And you've got premise indicators, which say, here's a conclusion, here comes a premise. So premise, therefore conclusion. Premise, thus conclusion. Premise from which it follows that conclusion. Premise, so conclusion. Premise, consequently conclusion. So I'm hungry, consequently, we should make dinner. They can also go the other direction, right? So we should make dinner. The fact that we should make dinner is shown by the fact that I'm hungry. The fact that we should make dinner since I'm hungry. We should make dinner because I'm hungry. So in this case, the conclusion comes first and the premise comes after. And so which kind of inference indicator you're looking at can help you figure that out. Or if there's no inference indicator, you kind of just have to determine it from context. You have to think about what the person who you're speaking to knows and what you want them to believe or what they want you to believe, and then figure out from context which is being given as a premise and which is being given as a conclusion. Should be easy, right? Fairly straightforward. Okay. I mean, so these are the sort of first baby steps in doing what is a somewhat difficult task, which is looking at a long passage of text and determining what the conclusion is. That is not trivial by any means. I can tell you that undergraduates struggle with this in essays all the time. You give them a 10-page paper and ask them to identify the conclusion, and you'll get from 50 different students, you'll get 50 different conclusions. So it's not that easy. This is the sort of like the first baby steps in that process that we're going to continue to elaborate throughout this semester. But one of the things that you're going to have to do is learn to look at an argument or purported argument and figure out what is the conclusion being argued for. So you also have to decide whether the thing that you're looking at is actually an argument or not. So there are some things that look like arguments, but they're really not arguments. So strongly worded conclusions. Sometimes when you're in a debate, people just say what they think like louder and louder and consider that to be a kind of argument. They're just sort of like strongly wording their conclusion in great passion. Maybe they throw some insults in just for spite or something like that. And it kind of sounds like an argument sometimes. But that's not an argument as we're understanding it in this course. It's not giving reasons for believing something. It's just sort of like strongly insisting that somebody believe what you believe. Stories or random thoughts, they don't really look that much like arguments, so we'll sort of skim over that. The thing that we're going to have to spend some time on is explanations. So explanations can be arguments. Arguments kind of can be explanations, but they're not exactly the same thing. They don't have the same essential properties. So we'll get to that at the end. So on the subject of strongly worded conclusions, which of these two tweets is an argument if either of them is an argument? So is the first one an argument? This fight to defeat the GOP healthcare plan is going to take all of us standing together, hand in hand. Is that an argument? Is that one thing being given as a reason to believe another thing? No, not really. Okay, what about the second one? Same, this is from a Democratic, I think she's a senator from California. We need to stop saying folks are going to lose their health care if the GOP repeal bill passes. We're not losing it, they're taking it away. Is that an argument? I'm seeing both nods and shaking of heads. Okay, good. So does anybody want to defend their view? To explain why this is or isn't an argument? Nobody wants to do that. Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
So she's making the argument, and then she's inferring that like it's not we're losing it, and then she's concluding it with they're taking it away.
Yeah, I think it is an argument. So she's got two things in here. Does this sound right to you? So she's got two things in here. The conclusion is we need to stop saying folks are going to lose their health care. Right? So this is the conclusion of this argument is just people should stop using this phrase, we're losing our health care. And the reason being given is we're not losing it, they're taking it away. Right? So if you thought this was an argument against the GOP healthcare plan, it's not that. Right? That's not the conclusion of this. If this is an argument, that's not the conclusion. It's the general topic, but this is an argument, it's just not a great one, right? Okay, so and part of what I want to emphasize to you here is that calling something an argument is not to say that it's super important or interesting or convincing or any of that stuff, okay? So if you were already predisposed to like the Republican healthcare plan, this is very unlikely to convince you otherwise, right? Very unlikely to change your general opinion about that topic. But that's not exactly the conclusion of the argument, is it? She's just saying we need to stop saying this one thing, right? Okay, so again, calling something an argument can make it sound really elevated. It's like, oh, now this is going to change my way of thinking and seeing. In this case, it's a small argument. It's very short. I mean, it's less than 140 characters. And its conclusion is not that groundbreaking, right? It's just like, stop saying this one thing. And it's not even a fully like convincing argument for that either, is it? Right? It's a reason, but it might not be like, oh, well, this is like definitely I'm never going to say that again. So calling an argument doesn't mean it's convincing, doesn't mean even that it's good. All it means is that it's one thing being given as a reason for another thing. If you're considering these two tweets in terms of their rhetorical force, like how much they do what this senator wants them to do, I think she's a senator, what she wants to do is reach out to people who agree with her, get their emotions a bit going, remind them of the issue. These do about the same amount of work in that regard, I would say. Wouldn't you? Like, they're about equally rhetorically powerful, right? So just making it an argument doesn't automatically make it convincing. And she's probably not really trying to present an argument, really. Like, this isn't meant to sway minds exactly. It's meant to speak to people who already agree with you. But one is in the form of just a statement, and one is in the form of one thing being given as a reason to believe another thing. Is that clear enough? Like why one of those is an argument and why one isn't? And why just because something's an argument doesn't mean that it's good or interesting or important or convincing? No? Okay. Good. So stories or random thoughts are another thing that can look a lot like arguments, but often aren't. This one doesn't even look like an argument. This is just like a random anecdote. We drove to Moncton to visit Sally in the morning, spent the afternoon in Sackville with Ono and his family, and then stopped at Betty's for dinner at Amherst. By the time we arrived in Halifax last night, we were happy about visiting friends, but tired from all the driving. There's no thing that you're trying to be convinced of there. It's a series of factual statements, right? Sorry, I couldn't find anything that was like a story that looked like an argument. This is just a random rambling story. All right, so that's pretty easy, right? Like, not every set of sentences is an argument. Some are just like random sentences, yeah? All right, let's get on to the hard thing. So this is the tricky one to distinguish from arguments, it's explanations. And I think this is worth doing because it's worth understanding what arguments are really supposed to be for. And this is something that people very often get confused about. So just to start off, we'll say explanations can be arguments, and arguments can be explanations. They can overlap. One thing can be both of those two things. However, not all explanations are arguments, and not all arguments are explanations. Okay? So what is the difference? Explanations, I want to claim, are when you know a thing and want to understand it. You want to know why this thing that you know is true. Arguments, on the other hand, are when you want to know whether something is true, right? So my example here is Newton and the tides. So you're all aware that there are tides, like the water level of the oceans goes up and down on a periodic basis, right? Everybody's known that for forever, right? Anybody who's sat by the beach for more than like a couple of hours is aware that the water rises and goes down. What we didn't know for a very long time was why, right? So the fact that there are tides was well known, well recorded. We have extensive records of the tidal going up and down. We didn't understand why until basically Newton, who argued that, he explained that what causes the tides is the gravitational attraction of the moon. So the moon has some gravitational attraction. It pulls the water towards it, which makes the water level near the moon go up and away from the moon go down, right? So this is an explanation of the tides. Because what you're doing is taking a well-known, sort of like everybody agrees that this is a thing, the tides happen, and trying to give reasons why it should be so. And Newton's reasons at the time were not kind of well understood things, not commonly accepted. What he said was, there's an invisible force emanating from all matter that permeates the universe and binds everything together. That was his pitch for why there are tides. Now, if you're living back in Newton's day, that sounds pretty wild, right? That sounds like pretty bizarre, and you're not quite as sure about that. You're very sure that there are tides, right? Everybody agrees on that. Not everybody at that time agreed that there was such a thing called universal gravity, that every object in the universe is gravitationally bound to every other object by this invisible force that you can't see or feel or touch, but affects everything. Yeah?
So let's say that something that was considered that's an argument years ago can now be considered an explanation. Maybe it starts out as an argument, but then it validates itself as the truth.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, something that was an argument can become an explanation. That's right. So if it's, well, yeah, no, that's fine. What it depends upon is the knowledge state of the person receiving it. So whether something is an argument or explanation, and we'll go through examples in just one second, depends on who's listening and what they know about the world. Right? So it's about, the difference depends on what you're trying to do to the person or for the person that you're speaking to. So because in this case, people did not know about gravity already, it was an explanation. So if you use gravity to explain the tides, you're using something that's less well known, less well understood, to illuminate something that's really well known and well understood. Now if it was an argument, so suppose that you've never been near a big body of water, you've lived in a landlocked city your whole life, you've never heard of the tides, you're unaware of any such thing as tides, but you're really familiar with Newton. You've read your Newton, you understand gravity, and you say, hey, given that there's universal gravitation, I bet the water level is going to go up and down. Now that would be an argument, right? So you're saying, look, everybody agrees that there is universal gravitation, therefore we should expect the water level to go up and down as the moon goes around the Earth. Now that would be an argument using the exact same thing, using universal gravitation and the tides, but in one case, back in Newton's day, everybody understood and knew about the tides, and universal gravitation was the kind of questionable thing. Whereas in this case, in this weird scenario where somehow you know all about gravity, but you've never heard of the tides, you're using something that you know well, gravitation, to suggest, to argue for, justify the idea that there should be something called the tides, or there should be like water level going up and down. So the difference is in what you're trying to do, right? What you're trying to do with the set of statements. This is it. Arguments start from well-known premises and move to a conclusion that is less well-known or maybe like less agreed upon. Whereas explanations start from often something unknown or from surprising facts. And what we do with them is we show that they entail something that's well-known. If your starting point and your ending point are both well-known, it can be both an argument and an explanation. So it's the distinction only really happens when there's sort of relative ignorance about one thing. Philosophers call the thing to be explained the explanandum, and the thing that does the explaining the explanans. So in an explanation, the explanandum, the thing to be explained, has to be well known, or at least agreed upon that it exists and is a fact. Right? You don't explain things that you don't actually believe. Right? So somebody explained to me why leprechauns have a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Well, you can't explain that because that's not a fact, right? You can explain facts. And you don't need to have well-known, well-understood explanations to explain things. Sometimes you can bring in novel ideas, novel formulas, or theories to explain something like Newton did with the tides. Whereas in an argument, you absolutely must start from agreed upon premises, right? And this is the pitfall. This is one of the major pitfalls that I'd like to sort of flag for you today in the way people evaluate arguments. The way to run an argument is to start from something that you can agree upon, not from something controversial. Right? And then you use that agreement and some reason to believe that that first thing is a reason to believe the conclusion to get somebody to believe the conclusion. Right? So it's about where you start. Do you start from something well-known, or do you start from something not well-known? Okay, so let's just do a couple of examples and try this out. So is this an argument or an explanation? And I want to emphasize to you that these could be either depending on the context. So what I'm going to ask you to do is think about which contexts these would be arguments in, or which contexts they would be explanations in. So we already just did this one, right? The tides go in and out because of the gravitational attraction of the moon. If you know all about the tides going in and out, you've lived by the ocean your whole life, you've seen the tides go in and out every day, this could only be an explanation of the tides, right? You're explaining the tides, this well-known thing, by this relatively less well-known thing. Whereas if you know all about physics and you've never been near the ocean, maybe this is an explanation of, or an argument for that there should be tides, something like that. Yeah? Okay? All right, let's try another one. So there must be some kind of insect in the trees. The leaves all have holes in them. Is this an argument? Is this more likely to be an argument or an explanation? Yeah.
Argument.
Likely to be an argument. Why?
Because it's a reason to believe something else, and it's not like universally known, I guess.
Okay, good. And how about, so it is a reason, it is one thing being given reason to believe another thing. So what makes this an argument rather than an explanation? So it's about your knowledge states about the two bits. Yeah, yeah. The second half is a conclusion. That's right. That is correct. But why is that the conclusion?
Because the first thing explains it. Because everyone agrees upon it.
So, right. That's everyone agrees upon it. That was the crucial thing, or at least it's a thing that's very accessible. Yeah.
Like the last part is the premise, and the first part is like an inference.
That's right. Yeah. So the last part is wait. Did you say the last part was the conclusion? Okay, then that was wrong. I'm sorry. The conclusion of this. So if this is an argument, the conclusion is this first sentence. There must be some kind of insect in the trees, right? And if this is the premise is the leaves all have holes in them. So the premise here is designed to be something that would be accessible. So if you walk up to a tree, you can just look and see if there's holes all in it, right? If there's holes all up in the leaves, it's very accessible. You can like look at it and see that there are holes in the leaves, right? So the example is designed to make one of these things easy to observe and therefore easy to agree upon. And then what you're saying is you're making inference that there must be bugs in the tree, right? So that's something that's less well known. In this case, you're saying the must be there kind of indicates that you're not really sure, or that you didn't like see the bugs yourself, right? Yeah.
Is it a bit of both? Like if, for example, your premise also becomes your explanation, but at the same time it's an argument. Because when we say that there must be some kind of insect in the trees, the explanation is the leaves all have holes in them, but at the same time it's an argument as well.
I'm not sure. Like, your explanation is that there are holes in the trees? Your explanation of what?
Insects. There are insects.
I'm not sure that holes explain the insects. They're a sign of the insects, right? Holes in the leaves are evidence that you use to infer that there are insects in the tree. So it's not really the same as an explanation. Right? An explanation, if you knew there were bugs in the trees, then maybe we could get an explanation going here, right? So I know that there are bugs in the trees. How do you know that? Well, no, that's still an argument. I still think this is an argument. Like, in a case, assuming that you are aware of the holes, you can observe the holes in the leaves, and you can't observe the bugs, I think this has to be an argument. Yeah?
I think it only
Right, right. So yeah, if we're like, okay, this whole forest has bugs in the trees, and we know that these bugs eat holes in the leaves, then you might use this as an explanation. Good. Yeah.
The fact that the word must isn't there, does that make this argument like a fallacy? Because
It's not a very good argument. Yeah, the must. So it's a very strong conclusion. They say there must be some kind of insects in the trees. There are probably other ways for holes to appear in leaves. So yeah, it's probably not a very strong argument. Yeah. Okay, let's do another one. So my cat is afraid of loud noises because she had a difficult life as a kitten. I think this one can go either way. So what I want from you is to sort of imagine a case where this is an argument and a case where it's an explanation. So what knowledge state would you have to be in? So first of all, so we'll say, my cat is afraid of loud noises because. That because is an inference indicator, and it tells you that the first thing is the conclusion, right? It's a conclusion indicator. Says, my cat is afraid of loud noises is either the thing being explained or the thing being argued for. So how could this be an explanation? Start from there. Yeah.
Let's say you didn't know your cat very well as a kid.
Right.
So you could just be trying to explain a reason for your cat being afraid of loud noises.
Excellent. So you could be trying to explain a reason why my cat is afraid of loud noises. So suppose you come over to my apartment and I put a mug down and the cat runs away and you're like, what's up with your cat? We say, well, she had a very difficult life as a kitten and that's why she's afraid of loud noises. Right? Is there a way to flip this around? So suppose you did know my cat very well as a kitten. Suppose you were there when she had a very difficult kittenhood, I guess. And then you were trying to infer what she'd be like as an adult. You say, well, my cat had a very hard life as a kitten, and that's probably why. So my cat is afraid of loud noises because she had a difficult life as a kitten. What you're inferring there is that she's afraid of loud noises or something like that. Yeah.
I don't see any doubt in this explanation, so it's more like not an argument but an explanation. So because she had, I'm 100% sure that she had a difficult life as a kid.
Well, just because somebody, so you said the question is, you don't see any doubt in this, and so how could it be an argument? People often phrase arguments without any doubt in them, and yet they're not certain. So just because somebody tells you that they're certain doesn't mean you have to believe them, right? So it could be the case that you're just wrong about one or two of these parts of this, right? So just because they're hedging or they're speaking confidently certainly doesn't mean that they are well justified. Yeah, question up here. I think it's plausibly interpreted as an explanation. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Would like the only difference between it being an explanation and an argument, an explanation is that you already know that what the kitten was like, what the kitten went through, and then the argument is like you just assuming like not knowing what the kitten, the cat went through as a kitten. Would that be the difference between the two?
So So the difference between the two is about which bit of it you're confident in, unless you're confident in both. So if it's an explanation, you could be confident about both of them, really. All right. Let's move on. So I think this one is much more plausibly interpreted as an explanation. It's hard to get it to fit into the form of an argument, but move on. So here's another one. Should be easy. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west because of the rotation of the earth. I don't know. So yeah, is this an argument or an explanation? Plausibly. Yeah.
It would all depend on who you're speaking to.
It's true.
If it's someone who has a good understanding of science,
Yeah.
it would just be an explanation. But if you talk to a child who doesn't understand science, then this would be an argument.
So okay. So just to repeat that, the claim is that if you it would be an argument for somebody who doesn't understand science, but just an explanation for somebody who does. So I would say this is an explanation for anybody who's like been outside during the evening or the morning, where you see the sun. So what's observable and what's accessible and what's agreed upon are these facts about the sun, and then the kind of unobservable or hard to know thing is the rotation of the Earth. So yeah. Do you have a comment? Okay. Is this like, is the distinction I'm trying to make here coming across? Is it fairly clear? I don't think I'm going to be asking you to do much of this stuff, like actually doing this. And here's one that has no content whatsoever, so you have to just like imagine what's up. It is likely that the fleens have failed to terp due to excessive frac. Okay, so you know nothing about any of these concepts. These are all totally made up concepts. Nonetheless, I think you can tell what you'd have to know in order to call this either an argument or an explanation. So if this is an argument, suppose it's an argument, what is the conclusion of this argument? It is likely that the fleens have failed to terp, right? And you can tell that because there's an inference indicator there, the do to. So the do to is supposed to be if this is an argument, it's a premise, the excessive frac. So if this is a premise, if the excessiveness of the frac is a premise, it should be something like publicly accessible. There should be frac everywhere. Everybody can see it. You have to walk around it in the streets, right? So you know that there's too much frac, and what you're saying is this frac that's everywhere is probably the reason why the fleens have failed to terp. Now, suppose that the fleens failing to terp is the obvious fact, right? Suppose that's what's obvious to everybody. They just haven't terped this year, and we're trying to figure out why. In that case, this could be an explanation, right? So it's an explanation of why the fleens failed to terp. Maybe the frac isn't something that's everywhere. Maybe it just happens in the basements on Sundays or something like that. And so not everybody's observed it. So everybody knows that the fleens have failed to terp. And you say, well, I can explain that. Too much frac. That's what's up. Okay? So again, it's the knowledge states. We're going too slow here, so I gotta move along. So the whole point of the premise is that they should be something we can either agree upon or know how to check. You don't necessarily have to agree automatically about all the premises that are in an argument, but if you don't know how to check them, then they're not good premises, right? This is the point of premises. The difference between an argument and an explanation is that you agree on the premises. Sometimes in complex arguments, we give reasons for believing premises. So you give a chain of premises. One premise justifies another premise, which justifies the conclusion. This is because sometimes the thing that justifies the conclusion isn't something that everybody already agrees upon, but you can give them a reason for believing that first thing, right? But every single argument in the entire history of arguments has had unjustified premises in it, premises that are not argued for. And I'm confident of that. I'm extremely confident of that. Because what do you do? When you want to justify something, what do? You give a premise that justifies it. Well, now you have an unjustified premise in your argument. What do you have to do to justify that premise? You have to give another premise, and so on, in an infinite regress, right? Every single argument always starts with unjustified premises, right? Hopefully, they're unjustified premises that everybody agrees upon, right? So that's when you start from axioms in math. The axioms are supposed to be things that are so obviously true that you don't even need an argument for people to accept them. But every argument starts from some unjustified premise or other, which is why it's so frustrating when people online and undergraduates writing essays and tons of people critique an argument because it has an unjustified premise. They just say their whole critique is just like, well, you said this, but you didn't justify it. But that's true of every single argument ever, right? There are always unjustified premises, which is why you need your premises to be common ground. You need them to be shared amongst at least the people having the conversation in order for them to do their job, which is to take you from something well-known to something less well-known. So don't do that in your argument analyses. Don't go to one of the premises and say, well, you didn't give me an argument for this premise, therefore it's a bad argument. Because that's not sufficient, right? If a premise is questionable, like genuinely dubious, or is the thing being debated, then it's a problem, right? If you use as a premise something that people don't agree on, that's a problem with your argument. But you can't just say, well, you didn't justify your premise, therefore I don't believe you, because that's a feature of literally every argument ever presented. Okay, so don't do that in your argument analyses. Don't just be like, well, this editorial said that there was a study that showed this, but they didn't explain the study or something like that, or they didn't justify why we should believe the study. That's just a really, really weak criticism of an argument. And it shows ignorance of how arguments work. Right? Arguments work by starting from something that is either plausible or that people generally accept, and moving to things that they're less likely to accept, sort of raising the probability of the conclusion. So this is the problem of controversial premises, right? So suppose in the context of this, suppose that a religious person is talking to a non-religious person, trying to convince them that the Bible is the true word of God. And here's their argument. The Bible is true because it was revealed by God. How's that as an argument? Is there some problem with that argument? Yeah.
It assumes that everybody believes in God.
Right. It assumes the belief in God and the trustworthiness of the Bible, therefore, to show the trustworthiness of the Bible. It's precisely the thing that, in this scenario that I've sort of set up for you, is under debate, right? So if you're using a premise that it is the thing that you're debating, that's not common ground for you, is it? Okay. So don't do that. Similarly, don't do this. Suppose somebody said, you should always accept the results of scientific studies because scientists say that science is a reliable method of investigation. Suppose you're debating with somebody who's denying climate science or denying evolution. Is that a good argument? No, for exactly the same reasons. That's a terrible argument, right? You can't just appeal to the thing that's under debate, right? If somebody's saying to you, I don't really believe in evolution, I think scientists are all liars, you say, well, of course you should believe scientists. Scientists tell us that they're correct. Right? That's a terrible argument. You should come up with a better argument. Which doesn't make either of the conclusions of those two arguments false, by the way. So we'll talk much more about this on Thursday, but like what we need to distinguish is bad arguments for true conclusions and sometimes okay arguments for false conclusions. Like you can have a valid argument for a false conclusion if its premises are false. So I think science is a reliable method of investigation, but I think this is a garbage argument for that position. Okay. Here's another one, more political. You shouldn't believe what you hear on Fox News. Right-wing news sources can't be trusted because they reject gun control and women's reproductive rights. Right? Also, not a good argument. Because broadly, calling something right-wing describes like a cluster of beliefs that usually go together, things like we shouldn't have gun control, there should be restrictions on abortions, things like that. So if you're saying you can't trust them because they believe that thing that I don't like, that's not a good argument. Once again, you're appealing to something controversial to try to establish something controversial. Right? So if your premises are not more well agreed upon than your conclusion, you're not getting anywhere. Your argument is not doing the job that arguments are supposed to do. You can do this with explanations, right? And this is why I tried to distinguish arguments from explanations for you. You can, if you want to explain the tides, you can appeal to your controversial theory of universal gravity to do that, because you're going to something well known. If you're doing an argument, you're trying to get to a conclusion that maybe not everybody agrees upon. Yeah, question.
So when I was in high school,
Yeah.
they wouldn't let us source Fox News because at times they felt like they would make like extraneous claims on X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And so couldn't these be in that case considered like an explanation where like a teacher tells you like, okay, I don't want anybody citing Fox News because there are times where a lot of their claims are very egregious or like ill-informed or etc.
Okay, so that would be an argument. I think that's so if you want to say, I don't think you should trust Fox News because they say a lot of things that are false. That's an argument. It's not I mean, it needs more filling out with examples and it should be defended more than that. But that is an argument. Like, don't believe that news source, they are unreliable. And I can give you a bunch of things that they said that were lies or something like that. So that is an argument. This is not an argument because this is not saying, so, and what I take it makes the difference is everybody agrees that liars shouldn't be trusted, right? Nobody would disagree. Nobody would come to the bat and say, I think we should just trust liars because we're good people and everybody deserves a 15th chance or something like that. So what you do in the argument is you say, these guys are liars, you shouldn't trust liars, therefore you shouldn't trust these guys. You're appealing to something that at least everybody agrees upon. Don't trust liars. And then you'd have to give a bunch of examples of them lying to get the second thing. But that's an OK argument, assuming the premises are true. Whereas this, you're really just appealing to, like, I don't like what they're saying, therefore you shouldn't trust them. It's the degree of controversy of the premises that makes the difference, I would say. OK. Similarly, we'll just flip this around with the exact same structure, the exact same problems, but the politically opposite direction. You shouldn't believe what you hear on the CBC. Left-wing news sources shouldn't be trusted because they promote gun control and abortion. Right? It's the exact same problem. If you're talking to somebody who believes there should be no gun control or abortion, and you give them this argument, like, it probably feels good to say stuff like this, like you're saying your opinion, and it feels to you like evidence because you believe that there should be gun control and there should be abortions, right? So you believe the premise, and you're trying to, for you, they're like, this premise is a good reason for me to believe the conclusion. But if they don't believe the premise, you're not going to convince them of anything. Right? So you must start from common ground. Far from being a form of conflict, which is how people usually think about arguments, a good argument must start from agreement, right? You must start from common ground. You must start from something that the other person is going to accept, or you won't convince anybody of anything. Okay? Okay, so this class was just me ranting about arguments. All right, so next time we actually will do some exercises and we'll talk about identifying the structure of argument. Okay, thanks.